Good evening. So my name is Philip Federico. I'm with the law firm of Baird, Mandelis, Broxed, and Federico. It's nice to have everybody here. You really never know what's going to happen. It's sort of like having a party where you send out invitations and you don't know if anybody's going to come. So this is a good turnout, but it's really indicative, I think, of the significance of the problem and people's interest in fixing the problem, which is why we're here. We're here to tell you about the problem and tell you how we intend to work with the community and work with Perdue to fix it. Why are we here? And if you look down, and I know some of you in the back probably can't see this very well, but on the right, this is the Perdue wastewater disposal. This is the actual pipe that goes into Peggy's branch that actually carries wastewater from the plant that contains PFAS right into that water supply. And then here we have a sample of a spray irrigation rig which disposes of wastewater. This wastewater then seeps into the groundwater and eventually into your wells. And I want to show you a little clip from the news, which is really a good summary of where we are at the moment.
Finding in the search for answers after forever chemicals were discovered. Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight here for the news at 6. I'm Steve Hammond. The Maryland Department of the Environment tells WBOC that Perdue Farms is, quote, a responsible person for the contamination. WBOC's Hunter Landon is on the story again tonight. Hunter, that determination means Perdue is tasked with the cleanup.
Steve, the company sent out letters to 550 property owners where it says wells should be tested. MDE confirmed today that one well on Perdue's property had PFAS levels at more than 1,300 parts per trillion. The EPA standard is no more than 4 parts per trillion.
A spokesperson for the law firm says more people have reached out since the suit was announced. It cites the negative health impacts exposure to PFAS could cause. The chemicals have been linked to cancer and other health problems. That suit asks for PFAS contamination to end and for financial compensation from Perdue for lost property value. The Maryland Department of the Environment tells WBOC the PFAS were discovered at Perdue's agribusiness property, seen here from Chopper 16. More details emerging in a potential environmental crisis in Wicomico County.
And one more note on the lawsuit. The plaintiffs are also seeking funding for a medical monitoring program that is tailored to the exposure risks posed by PFAS.
So why are we here? We learned, frankly, as a result of testing that was done by MDE. And MDE is the Maryland Department of the Environment. They're responsible for making sure that the environment in Maryland stays clean, that we have clean drinking water and we have clean air. They did testing, as did Perdue, of Perdue's groundwater, their monitoring wells, and their wastewater, which contained extraordinary high levels of PFAS. We also learned about Perdue sending those letters out, which indicated that they knew they had a problem to over 500 homes. They wanted permission to test the drinking water, and they offered bottled water to residents, which is a good thing to do, and the appropriate thing to do. Our law firm recently handled a case in the Millsboro community in Sussex County involving Mount Air chicken. Now, the contaminant there was nitrates. It wasn't PFAS. But everything else about that case was very similar to what is going on in this case. They were taking their wastewater that had too much nitrate in it and putting it into the groundwater, and people were getting sick, getting cancer, etc. In that case, we settled the case for $205 million. $140 million went to what's called remediation, or fixing the problem. So if you live in that community today, you have clean water and you have clean air, and you will for the foreseeable future. So our law firm's experience with PFAS in particular is ongoing. Currently, we have a case against WL Gore. These are the people that make Gore-Tex. Many of you probably wear, gear, or if you hunt like I do, I wear Gore-Tex gear. And the contaminant PFAS is actually used to make Gore-Tex. Well, this PFAS is in the groundwater in Cecil County and has been for about 2 decades now. And we currently have a lawsuit where we represent a proposed class in a class action for this community of more than 5,000 people. So we currently represent dozens of water providers as well, not just people, but actually companies that provide water and municipalities in the MDL in South Carolina in federal court that involves PFAS. So we have a lot of experience when it comes to PFAS litigation. The law and the science behind these cases is something that we deal with every day, we've been dealing with for years, and we're actually experts. We have great expertise in this area. I'd like to bring up my partner, Chase Brockstead, who's going to take it from here.
Thank you, Phil. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Chase Brockstead. So who are we? So I want to talk a little bit about our legal team. Obviously, you've just heard from Phil, Brent Series, and Ray Fitch, who I think Brent may be arriving a little bit late tonight. He may be here by now. Ray's not going to be able to come tonight. Kathy Kramer and Stella Pratt are both here, and Matt Legg is part of our team as well. We have handled a number of cases. You heard Phil talk about the Mount Air case, which was the one in Sussex County, Delaware, and Millsboro. We just finished a case in South Carolina against a paper plant by the name of New Indy. Unlike this case, that was an air case. We don't know exactly whether or not air is a component, air emissions is a component of this case or not. Right now, we're focused on the groundwater contamination. Phil also talked a little bit about our experience in the Gore case and the PFAS MDL. Camp Lejeune is another case, environmental contamination case that we're working on as well. But everybody knows that the lawyers aren't the smart people. The smart people are the scientists. And so in these types of cases, we utilize environmental experts and environmental consultants, and we have several of those with us tonight. In the Mount Air case that Phil talked about briefly before, by the time we filed our complaint in that case, we had more than a dozen experts, and I think that by the time that the case was really going, I think we had upwards of 16 or 17. Same thing with the Gore case that we are prosecuting right now. But our environmental consultants, three of which we have here tonight, Deborah Jennings, Roger Truitt, Dr. Harvey Cohen, and then we also have an environmental wastewater expert, Ken Norcross. So we're going to talk a little bit about PFAS and its regulations, and I'd like to introduce you all to Deborah Jennings. She graduated with honors from the University of Maryland and Georgetown University Law Center. She was a partner at DLA Piper, a global law firm, for more than 30 years, and she chaired their national environmental practice for more than 20 years. We've been fortunate enough to be working with Deborah since 2018, and she's a big part of our team, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about PFAS and its regulations.
Thank you, Chase. Good evening. I'm Deborah Jennings. I'd like to talk to you about what these chemicals are, and then from a 50,000-foot level, what law governs them, how they're regulated, and that will kind of set the stage for more specific discussion about the investigation that we've undertaken, and that'll be from my two colleagues who are on the panel up there. First of all, what are PFAS? PFAS are initials, I'm only going to say this once because it's hard to say, perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. PFAS is actually the abbreviation for the entire group of chemicals, and then each chemical within that has its own set of initials, so literally it becomes an alphabet soup of chemicals. But these chemicals have certain common characteristics, and they're dangerous. So from here on, I'm going to refer to them as forever chemicals, and I'll help to explain why. They are man-made, lab-made chemicals, and as I mentioned, the entire group is referred to as PFAS, but it includes certain specific substances that are of interest in this case. One is PFOS, one is PFOA, and another is PXHXS, three different substances that have been detected, tested for at elevated levels, at the Perdue facility. So we're especially focused on those three. Now, why are they called forever chemicals? Because they tend not to biodegrade. They just stay in the environment and they stay in the human body. So they call them forever chemicals because unlike other things where the action of weather and time and so on causes them to biodegrade in the environment, with these substances, they don't, or they do to a very, very limited extent. They were widely used in industry, and they're also used in the agricultural industry, and they have the potential to accumulate in agricultural raw materials such as soybean. Now, we don't know yet. We're continuing to investigate how exactly this got into your groundwater, but we do know that soybean is certainly a major area of concern because of the potential for them to accumulate. And we also know, as I mentioned, that PFAS, PFOA, and PFHXS, those forever chemicals, were in the Perdue agribusiness groundwater. Now, why does this matter? What's the significance of having these chemicals? First of all, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, known as IARC, which is part of the World Health Organization, reviews health studies on these substances and makes determinations. And they have identified them as being, the major ones, as either being carcinogenic or potentially carcinogenic to human beings. So they're extremely dangerous substances. They include increased risk of cancer, especially prostate, kidney, testicular cancer. You can have decreased fertility or increased blood pressure during pregnancy, particularly. There are developmental delays in children. And by the way, because children are small, their bodies are small, they're much more susceptible to the danger than adults would be. So it's especially a concern for children. You can have reduced immune response, you can have interference with hormones, increased cholesterol, and/or obesity. And I will tell you, these are the established risks, but this is an evolving area of science, and we have experts who study it. There are many more potentially implicated diseases and risks to humans. When EPA, just this summer, I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but when they wrote their most recent rule that applies to drinking water, they said there is, and I quote, "There's no level of exposure to these two PFAS," this is PFOS and PFOA, present in this case, "without risk of health impacts." There's no safe level of exposure. Now, EPA, we're talking about United States Environmental Protection Agency. It's a federal agency in D.C. But how does this work exactly? Congress writes statutes. EPA then develops regulations within the mandate of the environmental statute. And then what happens across the country is the states write look-alike regulations that have to be virtually identical to what EPA has written. So the source of the law really comes from EPA. And I've been watching EPA for 30 plus years. I won't tell you how many, but a lot. And I've never seen them react in the way they've reacted to these chemicals. They formed a council in 2021, and the purpose of that council, it was focused on PFAS, and the purpose of that council was to accelerate the development of the law in a number of different areas, all focused on PFAS. So they started out with a health advisory, and this is while they were working on regulations. They had a health advisory, and you can see how low that number is. Let's see, 0.004 parts per trillion. I mean, this is a minute number, and as I have just told you, they now think 0 is a more appropriate number for health, when you're looking only at health. This past year, they promulgated a number of rules under different statutes, all aimed at PFAS. One is they characterized certain PFAS, including the two we're interested in here, as hazardous constituents, which means this is under the hazardous waste law and the Superfund cleanup law. You may have heard of those. What it means is it gives the agencies and individuals in citizen suits the power to sue someone who has contaminated the environment with these substances to make them clean it up. It creates the power to require corrective action. That was in February of this year. More recently, in April, and this is very significant here, they wrote the rule that applies to drinking water. Now, as I mentioned, the prior action in 2022 had been a health advisory. It was just guidance, it wasn't regulatory. So this is the first time they've created a regulation that applies. So in 2024, they promulgated a regulation that establishes a 4 part per trillion regulatory limit for drinking water and 10 for the third substance that is present here. Now you notice 4 is a much bigger number than 0.004. Does that mean they found it less dangerous? No. What it means is that when they write the standard for drinking water, the statute requires them to take into account the cost of treating the water. So once they take into account the cost and also the ability to test for the substance, the number gets larger. But at the same time, they wrote this regulatory standard, which is called a maximum contaminant level. They also wrote a maximum contaminant level goal of 0, because 0 is where they think there is no risk, only at the number 0. But even at 4 ppt, compare that to some of the findings we have already, 1,300 parts per trillion. I mean, it's a dramatically higher number that has been found. Now, technically, these regulations apply directly to a public a public water supply, but the same number would apply to your drinking water. If there were a cleanup, the same number would apply, the 4 part per trillion. So when we see numbers like 1,300 parts per trillion, it's very alarming. Those are very big numbers. And finally, EPA has promulgated rules in other areas. They have maximum concentrations in the receiving water, like Peggy's Branch. And you notice all of these things have happened in 2024. That's the result of huge focus by EPA on the subject of PFAS. So where does Maryland come in? As I mentioned, EPA oversees what the states do, and then once they approve a state's program, which is a look-alike for the federal one, then the states are the hands-on implementers, enforcers. So that's MDE's role here. They're actually the ones charged with implementing the standards, including the 4 PPT. Now, what have they done so far? Unfortunately, we don't know. They're not telling us. We would like to have them tell us, but we don't know. We do know that they've designated Perdue as a responsible person for PFAS contamination. They've found that Perdue's wastewater contains, as I mentioned, PFOS, PFOA, and the third forever chemical, and that the numbers were very high, 1,300 compared to 4. These results are very alarming, and they have led us to begin a comprehensive investigation of the groundwater plume to see how many of you are impacted by the elevated levels. So with that, let me turn it over to Roger, who's going to talk about the plume.
Thank you, Deborah. All right, so you know a little bit about who we are. We know what we're dealing with now as it relates to PFAS. We've been investigating this case for all of 24 days at this point in time, so we're pretty early on in our investigation. However, I'd like to talk to you about what we do know. And to do that, we've got one of our environmental consultants. His name is Roger Truitt. We've been working with Roger since 2017. Roger also, before becoming a lawyer, he was an environmental engineer. He then chose to get into the business of law, started representing the wrong side of the V, was also representing corporate defendants like Deborah. He was a partner in one of the largest private law firms in Maryland for 21 years. He was a practicing environmental engineer in Maryland and Delaware, and he's been serving as our technical, environmental, and legal consultant in cases, like I said, since 2017. Roger?
Thank you, Chase, and good evening, folks. Wow, what a crowd that's turned out tonight. Thank you. I'm going to take you through some figures, maps, to help you see what we've learned so far. Let me point out a few things on the map here. First of all, this is the Route 50 bypass of Salisbury, which then goes out to Ocean City, and of course you got the old Ocean City road here, and here's right here that's not circled is the Perdue headquarters and technical center. The site that we're looking at is another Perdue facility in this circle, which they call their agribusiness facility. It's quite large. It's approximately 200 acres, and the industrial part of it is in this area, and we'll focus in on that in a minute. But let me point out a few other things. First of all, it's on 6906 Zion Church Road, and as you'll hear from our groundwater expert in a few minutes, we understand that the groundwater is moving from east toward west. So right in here, for example, is a community called Heather Glen, if you're familiar with that. Yeah. And a couple of other things that I want to point out that we'll be talking about in a minute are a couple of streams. First of all, just on the south side of the Perdue facility, there's a railroad, and just beyond that, there's Peggy's Branch. Peggy's Branch runs up this dark green here all the way through into Johnson's Pond, which then goes into the Wicomico River. But on its way, it's going through a number of residential communities that are on private wells. There's another stream to the north, which is called Middle Neck Branch. It's coming through this dark green area, and eventually it joins Peggy Branch down in here. So what do they do at the Perdue Agribusiness Facility on Zion Church Road? There basically are three operations. They're listed there. This is a huge complex, industrial complex. So they do multiple things that have come online over the years. This facility goes back to something like the 1960s or before, when it was just a grain storage and feed mill. But then they added on to it, and they put in a soybean oil extraction process. And what that does is it crushes soybeans and brings the oil out of them, and then the solid part, after some more processing, becomes feed for animals. So then they take the soybean oil that's been extracted, and they take it to a refinery that's also on the site. And it refines the crude oil coming out of the soybean into a more refined state that can be used for other purposes. They also bring in crude oil from three other Perdue facilities and refine it here. So this is a very significant operation for Perdue, particularly with its oil refinery. And just to give you an idea, the refinery will, according to Perdue's own publication, handles 350 million pounds of oil every year at this facility. They load up tank trucks, tank cars, ship them all over the country. And they bring in soybeans from all over the country and from other countries to process at this facility. The main thing we've been looking at so far is the wastewater that's generated at this facility. And first of all, the documents we have seen to date, which are available publicly, indicate that Perdue discharges almost 1 million gallons of wastewater per day. And it's this wastewater that contains very high levels of the PFAS compounds that Deborah was speaking of just a minute ago. And by the way, we're looking here at the wastewater plant, which consists of some tanks, aerated lagoon, storage lagoon. In any event, the major sources, the soy oil extraction plant where they crush the soybeans that I mentioned, they indicate that there's 70,000 gallons of wastewater being generated per day. Similarly, for the oil refinery, another 70,000. And then there's a lot of cooling water that comes from the soybean extraction process. And they also have some hatcheries on the site that generate wastewater. The important thing to note is that this wastewater treatment plant right here does nothing to remove PFAS from the wastewater. And how do I know that? Well, Chase mentioned Ken Norcross, who's not here tonight, but we've worked with him on 4 or 5 cases. He's one of the foremost wastewater experts in the country. He's been looking at industrial facilities like this and working with them, troubleshooting for the last 40 years. And he has like 19 patents on wastewater treatment. Well, I sent all the background documents to Ken Norcross, and I said, Ken, so he knows what each of these processes is, does anything here remove PFAS? He says, not at all. And I said, well, could we remove the PFAS? Oh, yes. You can put in systems that will do that, but you'd have to greatly upgrade the plant at a huge expense. I want to talk a little more about how the wastewater is being disposed of. I mentioned Peggy's Branch. Again, let me orient you on the map here. Here's the wastewater treatment plant. This is the oil refinery here, we believe. These are grain storage tanks. And in here, we believe, is where the soybean crushing operation is. I mentioned there's a hatchery down in this area as well. So what Perdue has been doing is they've been spray irrigating part of the wastewater, about 20% we estimate, onto this large field. This is about 40 acres, and they have a center pivot irrigation rig here. They don't do it year round. They do it at certain times when there's supposed to be crops on there that are going to take up the nitrogen, but the crops don't take up the PFAS. So the PFAS goes down to the groundwater, as Phil had mentioned earlier. The other thing they do is they spray irrigate into this forest area. And we're not sure exactly where in the forest, but you see those little lines? Those generally are places where they can run pipelines and get access to maintain that spray irrigation. Now, 80% of their wastewater, 80% of nearly 1 million gallons a day, is going to Peggy's Branch. And here's Peggy's Branch. Well, guess where Peggy's Branch starts? The headwaters is right here at their wastewater treatment plant. So the only water going into this part of Peggy's Branch is what's coming out of the wastewater treatment plant and cooling water that might be coming here. So Deborah spoke about some of the high levels. I think she referred to them as alarming, and I would agree. What you see here in this figure, again, the same background. This is the wastewater treatment, the spray irrigation, Peggy's Branch. Here's the EPA drinking water standard, which again isn't necessarily safe based on the science that's been done. For these 2 compounds, PFAS compounds, the current limit is 4 parts per trillion. And for this one other one that we have found present, it's 10 parts per trillion. So what do we know so far? We know that the Peggy's Branch discharge from Perdue has been, their wastewater that's being discharged into Peggy's Branch has been tested, and it's been reported that the PFOS concentration is 694. The PFOA is 40. Okay, so those numbers are obviously, in this case, it's more than 10 times the standard. In the case of PFOA, it's 4 times. There also has been testing performed on the groundwater, and we don't know exactly where the test was done, but we believe it was done in this field. And the level that's been reported for the groundwater on the site is 1370 for PFOS and 1300 for this other PFAS compound, PFHXS. Again, very high numbers, 300 to 400 times the standard that EPA has set. So this figure shows, again, this is the actual pipe that the wastewater treatment plant is dumping into Peggy's Branch. And in a drought condition like we're having now, that's going to be the only water in Peggy's Branch. So we have almost 1 million gallons of this PFAS contaminated wastewater being disposed each day. 80% is going to Peggy's Branch. 20% is being irrigated to cropland and forest land north. And again, not year-round on the spray irrigation. I'm going to stop there, and I'll let Chase introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. So as I've mentioned a couple of times now, our investigation is ongoing. One of the things that we did right away was we engaged an expert that we've been using since 2018, Dr. Harvey Cohen, who is with us tonight. Dr. Cohen is a principal hydrogeologist at SS Papadopoulos and Associates. He graduated from Princeton University and Cornell University. He is an expert in mapping sort of groundwater flow, the fate and the transport of water contaminant. He's got over 50 publications and presentations. He's been somebody that we've been working closely with for a long time now, and he's going to tell you about, at this point in time, what our investigation has revealed.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm Harvey Cohen. I work with Papadopoulos and Associates. We're based in Rockville, Maryland. And my job here is to understand where the groundwater contamination might be going from this facility. So as you all know, we're here because there is no doubt there is groundwater contamination on the Perdue facility. It's very high. But the question then becomes, well, where is it going? Who might be exposed to it and how? As was mentioned before, I'm an expert in groundwater. For those of you who don't know, groundwater is simply water that's underground. In the case of Salisbury, we're talking about an aquifer, which is just a geologic unit that has a lot of water in it, which is mostly sand. And you probably recognize this when you're digging your garden. There's a lot of sand out here. You're taking water from your residential wells from an aquifer that's very sandy. The water flows between the sand grains. In this case, this is what we call an unconfined aquifer. There's nothing on top of it to protect it from contamination that's released to the surface. So the state would classify this as an aquifer that's susceptible to surface contamination. And that's why it's of concern to all of you who are on private wells in this area. I'm going to talk about where the groundwater is likely going, how fast it's moving, and the impact of what creates the changes in where groundwater flows. So the first thing I did when I was asked to look at this problem about 10 days ago, 15 days ago, was what information is there about the regional flow of groundwater? Well, there's some publications from the Maryland Geologic Survey and the U.S. Geologic Survey that talk about the flow of groundwater contamination. And those arrows on the map there show in a very general sense which way the groundwater is flowing. This map is not specific to your neighborhood or the area immediately west of the facility, but it does show this as part of a larger groundwater mapping exercise. And as you can see, the general flow of groundwater would be west and southwest from the edge of the Perdue facility. That means that the contaminants that travel with the groundwater, like this PFAS, would be flowing in that direction. Now, you also notice that down on the bottom left, I have a circle around what's called the Park Well Field. That is a well field that's serving the city of Salisbury. They pump a lot of water from there. And I pointed out, simply to point out that there are some factors that can affect which way the groundwater flow. Well fields for a city tend to draw a lot of water towards them. And in the case of the Park Well Field, the mapping done by the Maryland Geologic Survey shows it is in fact pulling water a little bit more to the south when you get over to that side of the town. But in general, we focused our investigation so far in the area west of the facility because that's where we believe the groundwater is flowing that would be carrying contaminants from Perdue. If you look at this map here, it just shows again the sort of pink area that is our initial focus area. We don't know where we're going to wind up in terms of what is the extent of contamination. There may be reasons why there's contamination outside of the zone. We just don't know yet. We're only, like I say, a couple weeks into the investigation. As many of you know, we've sent out letters on behalf of our client. We've been sampling wells, and we'll continue to do that to get some hard data as to where the contamination is and where it's moving to. Some of the results collected from the neighborhood are shown on this map. The numbers that Deborah was talking about on the right for the facility show PFOS and PFHXS over 1,000 parts per trillion. You've heard that already. But we've collected about 20 samples as of today in the neighborhood and some surface water samples as well. And some of those are quite high too, concentrations over 100 or 300 or even 900 in one location. So that is of concern. It's also consistent with our model of groundwater flowing to the west from the facility, and it's the same compounds in the water that we're observing, the PFOS, PFOA, and PFHXS, that were observed on site. So again, this is consistent with the conceptual model we have of how the groundwater is flowing, and where there may be homes that might be impacted by it. I'm going to hand it over now back to Chase. Oh, to Phil. Okay. Thank you very much.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the lawsuit that was filed very recently by us. It's filed as a class action lawsuit. And I want to talk with you a little bit about it's a 40-page complaint that our team of a dozen attorneys and paralegals were able to put together after just 24 days, less than 24 days of investigation. It is available to you if you want to read it. It's available online. We can always send you a copy. But I want to talk a little bit about what a class action is. And you say, well, why a class action? Well, you look around this room right now, and you have to understand that you people have the power. You know, when one of you goes individually and tries to deal with a corporation the size of Perdue, you really don't have any power. But when you all band together like you have tonight, and like I think the rest of your community will do, you can deal with this problem, they will listen, and they will fix it. So there's power in numbers. So to the extent that anybody hasn't signed up to participate in the case, we encourage you to do so, because we want to have you help us help you. The other benefit here is something called shared cost. We're going to spend, and we typically spend, probably between $3 and $5 million of our money. We advance it in this case. Why? Because we know it's a good case. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Why? Because hopefully we'll get our money back, okay? And I think we will. But that cost will not be borne by just one or two clients. It'll be borne by the class as a whole. We don't know how big this class is going to be. We know now it's at least 500 homes. It's probably going to be more. 2.5 people per household. So you can do the math. It's going to be a big class. I want to talk a little bit about the liability issues. This is a very strong case because the Maryland Department of the Environment has already said to Perdue, hey, this is your problem. You're a responsible party. So when we walk into a court in front of a jury, guess what we get to say? Hey, MDE, the Maryland Department of the Environment, said Perdue created this problem. Okay, it makes our job a little easier on liability. I want to talk a little bit about the extent of the impacted area. And what we do is we start at the source, we work our way out, and when we start finding normal results, we know where to draw the lines. So that's what we're going to be doing. You can help us by signing up. You can help us figure out how big this impacted area is. Next, I want to talk about the damages. There are basically three buckets of damages in this case. And I have them in a particular order because this first bucket, called remediation, is the most important. If you came here to get rich, you came to the wrong place, because that's not our goal, okay? Our goal is to fix the problem first and foremost, and that's what remediation is all about. So that's why it's first. So how do you remediate, which really means fix the problem? How do you do that? Well, you go to the source where the PFAS is coming from, and you turn it off. You stop the problem. Now, you heard from Roger Truitt say, there is a way to go to this facility and extract the PFAS from the wastewater before you put it into Peggy's branch and before you spray it into the forest or onto the field. We're going to do that, okay? We're going to do that. That's what we do. So you clean up the source of the problem. What do you do about all this water that's in the ground? Okay, well, there are a couple ways to deal with that. One of the ways is called pump and treat, where you actually pull it out of the ground, you treat it, you put it back in. It's a little expensive, but it's a way to treat it. And there's certain areas will really benefit a great deal by that. The other way to do it is filters. You know, you can put filters in homes, they're expensive, but that will solve the problem. You certainly don't want to be drinking with this water. You don't want to be bathing in this water. You don't want to be watering your garden with this water. And for you people that live, on farms and grow crops, you don't want to be using this water for your crops or for your livestock. So we're going to get you clean water. That's the other thing we do. The next thing we'll move to is talk a little bit about your property. Your property is not worth today what it was a month or two ago. There is a stigma associated with environmentally contaminated real estate, and that's unfortunately what we have to deal with in this case. We have experts who deal with real estate diminution, both rural and residential, and we will be able to figure out the loss for everybody's property. Finally, the health effects, which is probably the one that certainly tugs at me the most. My father used to tell me, if you have your health, you have everything. The rest of it you can figure out. But if you don't have your health, you really have nothing. And the most important thing we have and your community has is clean water and clean air. Because without it, we won't survive for very long. Okay? So what we know is that this PFAS causes cancer, causes other diseases. And as you know with cancer, you just can't step in front of a machine and it'll tell you whether or not you have cancer. You may have cancer in your body, but not know it for years. So in addition to taking care of the people who've already gotten sick, we need to medically monitor everybody in the community. Because the earlier you find cancer and these other diseases and treat it, the better the prognosis. So we will create a medical monitoring program for the community. So next steps, and I've talked about most of this. We actually wrote to the Maryland Department of the Environment, and interestingly enough, they didn't send us the documents we wanted immediately. No surprise there. But we know them, they know us, and we're going to stay on it, and we'll get their documents. We're going to, as Chase said, we're going to continue to retain additional experts, both environmental and health experts. We're going to continue to figure out the size of this plume that's been contaminated and the size of the class. And then we are going to work with our remediation experts to figure out how best to solve this problem. We want to have a dialogue with Perdue and MDE. And I really want to say in conclusion, I've lived in Maryland my whole life, and I've spent a good part of my life on the Eastern Shore. And I don't think Perdue's a bad company. I don't think they're bad people. But they have made a mistake. And I'm pretty optimistic that they're going to acknowledge that they've made a mistake. I'm pretty optimistic that they're going to hold themselves accountable and do the right thing. I can assure you that if they don't do the right thing, we will make sure they do, because that's what we do. So we will give them an opportunity to work with us in a collaborative way with the Maryland Department of the Environment to fix the problem and fix it now. See, our goal is we'd like to start the solution now instead of litigating this for 3 or 4 years and then start fixing the problem. So we will do our best to represent your community and get you the justice you're really entitled to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.